In this lecture, we are going to be looking at the dark side of the family. This will include discussion of how inequality impacts women as well as domestic abuse, its types and sociological explanations for why it happens. If this is going to be a difficult topic for you to look at, please speak to your teacher before continuing. Let's start by looking at the feminist argument that the family by its very nature is oppressive and exploitative of women. The family often reinforces gendered divisions of labor, limiting women's career advancement. Sociologists like Dunscombe and Marsden emphasize how balancing paid work, housework, and emotional labor, what they refer to as the triple shift, leaves women with less time and energy to pursue career opportunities compared to men. This unequal distribution of responsibilities not only hinders promotions, but also contributes to a perception of women as less reliable employees, further entrenching the gender pay gap. For example, in 2023, the gender pay gap in the UK was 14.9%. Women are also disproportionately represented in part-time or precarious work, primarily because of childcare and domestic duties. According to the Office for National Statistics, women made up 75% of the part-time workforce in 2022. While flexible work allows women to meet family obligations, it often limits their access to higher-paying full-time positions. This economic dependence often traps women in abusive relationships, where financial autonomy is undermined by systemic inequality. It wasn't just Dunscombe and Marsden who saw the triple shift as exploitative. Erin Green, in 1996, identified that while both men and women work outside the home, women's domestic roles are seen as extensions of their professional responsibilities. For example, women are often expected to manage household chores and childcare, even after a full day of paid work. This results in higher levels of stress and burnout for women, leaving little room for personal or professional growth. Jessie Bernard's work, The Future of Marriage, in 1982, also showed that women in traditional marriages are disproportionately burdened by domestic responsibilities, which often leads to feelings of dissatisfaction and unfulfilled aspirations. Bernard also linked this to negative impacts on women's mental health, noting that the emotional labor involved in maintaining a household is undervalued and invisible. Anne Oakley's landmark study, The Sociology of Housework, in 1974, was one of the first to highlight the repetitive, isolating, and undervalued nature of domestic labor. She conducted interviews with 40 housewives and found that housework was seen as an unpaid obligation rather than a valued contribution to the family. Women reported feelings of frustration and lack of fulfillment, as their work lacked recognition and societal value. More recently, a study by Adrienne Vieira in 2013 showed that women feel an increased pressure to engage in higher education and professional development in order to stay employable, which is adding more pressure and causing women to give up leisure time in order to still meet the family and household demands. Blanco in 2000 also found that working women who had the majority of the responsibility for home tasks alongside their paid work reported higher levels of anxiety, depression, and lower self-esteem when compared to working women whose partners shared more of the home tasks, all suggesting that the family and home are an exploitative and negative place for women, rather than the warm bath suggested by Parsons. While these sociological perspectives provide valuable insights into the structural inequalities within family life, they are not without criticism. One major critique is the tendency to overgeneralize women's experiences. Many of these studies focus on traditional, heterosexual, nuclear family structures, where gender roles are rigidly divided, failing to account for more diverse family forms. For example, in dual income or egalitarian households, domestic responsibilities may be more evenly distributed, challenging the assumption that women universally bear the brunt of unpaid labor. As family dynamics continue to evolve, the relevance of these traditional frameworks is increasingly questioned. Another significant limitation is the lack of intersectionality in much of this research. The experiences of women are not uniform, and factors such as race, class, and cultural background play a crucial role in shaping their engagement with domestic labor. For instance, women from higher income households may be able to outsource domestic work, hiring nannies, cleaners, or other household help, thereby reducing or even eliminating the pressures of the triple shift. Similarly, these studies often fail to consider same-sex couples, where traditional gender roles do not necessarily apply in the same way, making some of these explanations less universally applicable. Critics also point to the changing nature of gender roles as a challenge to these traditional sociological perspectives. Catherine Hakim argues that shifting societal expectations alongside increasing male participation in domestic labor, call into question the extent to which domestic inequality persists. The rise of dual career households and government policies, such as shared parental leave, suggest a move toward more equitable family arrangements. While inequalities certainly still exist, the rigid gender divisions of labor described in earlier feminist research may not reflect contemporary realities as accurately as they once did. Another key criticism is the overemphasis on victimhood. Some sociologists argue that these perspectives portray women as passive victims of patriarchal oppression, ignoring their agency and ability to negotiate roles within the family. Many women actively choose to prioritize domestic life, childcare, or part-time work based on personal preferences rather than coercion. While structural inequalities do shape these choices, the assumption that all women experience domestic roles as oppressive overlooks the complexity of individual decision-making and the diversity of modern family life. Moving on now to look more specifically at domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is defined as any incident of controlling, coercive, or threatening behavior, violence, or abuse between intimate partners or family members. This includes physical, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Unfortunately, it remains a significant issue, with evidence pointing to deeply rooted inequalities as a driving force. Domestic abuse is a pervasive and deeply entrenched issue that extends far beyond physical violence. While physical abuse, such as hitting, kicking, or strangulation, is often the most visible form, domestic abuse manifests in multiple ways, each designed to exert power and control over a partner. One of the most insidious forms is psychological abuse, which includes coercion, threats, humiliation, and manipulation. This type of abuse can be difficult to recognize, as it often occurs gradually over time. Victims may be subjected to gaslighting, where the abuser distorts reality to make them doubt their own memory or perception. Constant criticism, intimidation, and threats of harm, whether directed at the victim, their loved ones, or even pets, are all forms of psychological abuse that can leave long-lasting emotional scars. Research by Evan Stark, 2007, has shown that coercive control is often more psychologically damaging than single instances of physical violence because it instills constant fear and dependency. Another significant form is financial abuse, where an abuser exerts control by restricting their partner's access to money, employment, or financial independence. This can include preventing a partner from working, taking full control of household finances or forcing them into debt. Financial abuse is particularly dangerous because it often traps victims in abusive relationships, making it extremely difficult to leave due to economic dependence. Sexual abuse within relationships is another form of domestic abuse that is often underreported. This includes any form of non-consensual sexual activity, coercion, or manipulation into unwanted sexual acts. Some victims may not even recognize that what they are experiencing is abuse, especially in long-term relationships or marriages where traditional notions of spousal obligations may obscure the presence of coercion. In 2021, changes to UK law explicitly recognized coercive control and marital rape as crimes, reflecting the evolving understanding of consent within intimate relationships. Technological abuse is a more recent but growing form of domestic abuse, in which abusers use digital tools to harass, monitor, and control their victims. This can include tracking a partner's location through apps, hacking into emails or social media accounts, or using threats of online exposure to manipulate and intimidate. With the rise of smart technology, abusers have increasingly used tactics such as installing spyware on phones or remotely controlling home security systems to monitor victims. The impact of these forms of abuse is devastating, as highlighted by statistics from the Home Office, which reports that 2 women are killed every week by a current or former partner in England and Wales. Studies by Coleman and Osborne, 2010, further reveal that women are at a much higher risk of repeated and severe violence. However, while domestic abuse predominantly affects women, men can also be victims. According to the Office for National Statistics, ONS, nearly 1 in 4 women and 1 in 8 men experience domestic abuse at some point in their lives. Ultimately, domestic abuse is not just an issue of individual relationships, but a reflection of broader societal structures that enable and perpetuate violence. Recognizing the different forms of abuse is essential to tackling the issue and ensuring that victims receive the support they need. Domestic abuse is not merely an individual problem, it is deeply connected to structural inequalities, economic pressures, and societal norms. Each sociological theory provides a different lens for analyzing the causes and consequences of domestic abuse, highlighting the various ways in which power, control, and violence manifest in intimate relationships. Radical feminists argue that domestic abuse is fundamentally rooted in patriarchy. Dobash and Dobash in 1979 conducted extensive research into domestic violence and found that incidents were often triggered by what the abuser perceived as challenges to their authority. Their work revealed that men justified violence by claiming their partners were being disrespectful or disobedient, reinforcing the idea that male dominance in relationships is socially and culturally ingrained. Dobash and Dobash's research supports the argument that domestic abuse is not random, but rather a tool used to maintain male power over women. They argue that the traditional structure of marriage reinforces this inequality, as it historically positioned women as dependents, making it harder for them to leave abusive relationships. This perspective has been influential in shaping policies around domestic violence, leading to the recognition that abuse is not just a personal issue, but a broader social problem requiring systemic change. However, this view has been criticized for being overly deterministic. Eliot, 1996, challenges radical feminist explanations for underrepresenting male victims of domestic abuse and failing to acknowledge that abuse also occurs in same-sex relationships. While patriarchy is a significant factor, focusing solely on gender-based oppression can overlook other dimensions of domestic abuse, such as psychological, financial, and technological abuse, which do not always follow traditional gendered patterns. Marxist feminists provide an economic perspective on domestic abuse, arguing that capitalism exacerbates stress and frustration within families, which in turn fuels violence. Fran Ansley in 1972 famously described women as takers of shit, suggesting that domestic violence is a way for men to redirect their frustrations with the oppressive capitalist system onto their partners. According to this view, men, particularly in working class households, face economic exploitation and alienation in the workplace. Since they cannot challenge their employers or improve their economic conditions, they release their anger and frustration through violence at home. This explanation is particularly useful in understanding why domestic abuse is often more prevalent in economically disadvantaged areas. Financial strain, job insecurity, and housing instability can create conditions where tensions escalate into violence. In contemporary research, studies have shown a strong correlation between economic downturns and increased rates of domestic violence. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, reports of domestic abuse surged globally, with financial strain and enforced lockdowns creating a pressure cooker environment in many households. However, this perspective assumes that only men experience workplace exploitation and ignores that women also suffer under capitalism, often through precarious employment or unpaid domestic labor. Additionally, not all cases of domestic abuse are linked to financial stress. Abuse occurs in affluent households where economic hardship is not a factor. More recently, sociologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in 2010 take a materialistic approach, arguing that domestic abuse is driven by inequality and social stress rather than simply gender or capitalism. Their research suggests that violence is more common in households experiencing poverty, overcrowding, and financial instability. They argue that when families live under economic pressure, levels of stress and conflict increase, leading to a higher likelihood of violent outbursts. Wilkinson and Pickett's materialist explanation is supported by data showing that domestic violence rates are significantly higher in disadvantaged communities. Economic hardship can lead to substance abuse, mental health struggles, and emotional strain, which in turn increase the likelihood of abusive behavior. A contemporary study by Walby and Towers in 2018 supports this view, demonstrating that cuts to welfare services and reductions in social support increase women's vulnerability to abuse. When financial independence is weakened due to austerity policies, victims may find it even harder to escape abusive relationships. While this explanation is valuable in understanding the structural conditions that make domestic abuse more likely, it does not account for cases in wealthier households where abuse is often hidden behind closed doors. Additionally, this view may risk excusing abusive behavior by attributing it solely to economic conditions rather than personal accountability. Unlike the previous theories, which focus on systemic inequalities, postmodernist perspectives examine how changing relationship dynamics contribute to domestic abuse. Anthony Giddens in 1992 argues that modern relationships are characterized by confluent love, meaning that people now seek deep emotional connections and fulfillment from their partners. However, When these expectations go unmet, tensions can arise, sometimes escalating into abuse. Giddens suggests that relationships today involve greater emotional intensity, which can lead to heightened conflict, possessiveness, and even violence. This perspective is particularly useful for understanding abuse in middle and upper class households, where financial stress is less relevant, but emotional and psychological control play a significant role. For instance, Stark's 2007 research on coercive control highlights how abuse is often about power and manipulation, rather than physical violence alone. He found that abusers use tactics such as surveillance, isolation, and emotional degradation to maintain control, often without ever resorting to physical violence. A recent example of this is the increasing recognition of technological abuse in relationships. The rise of smartphones and social media has led to new forms of control, such as tracking a partner's location, hacking into emails, or threatening to release private information online. This aligns with Giddens' view that abuse in contemporary relationships is shaped by changing social norms and expectations around intimacy. However, critics argue that postmodern perspectives do not adequately address how structural inequalities, such as gender, class, and race, still shape experiences of domestic abuse. While emotional dynamics are certainly important, focusing on intimacy alone overlooks the broader societal factors that enable abuse to persist. As we have seen, no single sociological explanation fully accounts for the complexities of domestic abuse. Radical feminists highlight the role of patriarchy in maintaining male dominance, while Marxist feminists point to capitalism as a source of frustration that fuels violence. Wilkinson and Pickett emphasize economic inequality, and Giddens draws attention to the emotional dimensions of modern relationships. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses, but taken together, they provide a more comprehensive understanding of domestic abuse. To effectively combat this issue, policymakers must address both structural and individual factors. This includes challenging patriarchal norms, providing financial support to vulnerable households, offering psychological resources for victims and perpetrators, and ensuring that the justice system recognizes all forms of abuse, including coercive control and technological abuse. Recent efforts, such as the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 in the UK, have made strides in recognizing these complexities. However, much more work is needed to change societal attitudes and provide better support for survivors. Domestic abuse is not just a personal problem, it is a reflection of deeper societal structures that must be challenged and reformed. Only through a combination of education, policy reform, and cultural change can we hope to create a future where domestic abuse is no longer a hidden epidemic, but a problem actively addressed and eradicated from society.